Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. I am going to be reading a devotional that I have written for you guys. I was wanting to do something like I did for our Christmas time, the Advent time, for the first 25 days of Christmas, and giving you a devotional to read each day of Advent season during that time of year. And I wanted to do the same thing for Easter, for this week of Easter, but I find myself in a situation where I can't necessarily give you the hard copies. So I'm going to be making videos reading these to you guys. If you want the hard copy, just let me know. I will send you one in the email or hard mail, whatever you want, snail mail, if you prefer that. But I'm not going to be having them at the church for now, since none of us are joining at the church. So I'm going to be reading these to you. Thanks for joining and hanging in for these next few minutes as I just help one another anticipate the resurrection. That's what Easter's all about. One of the reasons I did the Christmas ones was to help us get our minds off of what society really does with Christmas. And these Easter devotionals are the same, to get our minds off of bunnies and eggs and think about why in the wide world we're celebrating Easter. We're the church. So let's glorify Christ together. I'm going to start by reading a couple of the key passages for this devotional, and then the devotional will dive into just talking about that. So I'm going to read Matthew 16, 21 through 23, and Isaiah 52, portions of Isaiah 52 and 53. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And Isaiah, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and he shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sins of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. As a father of five, I hear a lot of tall tales. Whether the tale is about unicorns, Pokemon, or snakes, there is always some entertaining story coming from one of my children's lips. Some of the stories my kids tell me are misunderstandings or mistakes, and some are just whimsical fancies of a child's imagination. Regardless of the reason for the fanciful story, one thing is always true: the story is false. I imagine that Peter was typically pretty attentive and responsive to Christ's teachings. When asked a question, he'd give an answer. If he didn't understand a parable, he'd ask questions. But this time, Peter was a bit bolder. A disciple could rarely be found disagreeing with his rabbi, let alone rebuking him. But in Matthew 16, we find Peter respectfully pulling Jesus to the side so as not to rebuke him publicly, and he essentially tells Jesus that he's off his rocker. What's interesting about this passage is that we don't find Jesus simply making an abrupt declaration about a foreboding future, as would a poster boy, end-of-the-world activist. Rather, we see that Matthew says Jesus began to show his disciples that he was going to die and rise from the dead. In order to show something to someone, that thing has to already exist. If I wanted to show you a history of the United States, I would not make up details out of thin air. Nor would I simply tell you things that I already know, since that wouldn't be showing, but rather just telling or teaching. I'd take you to history books and timelines that were already made. If I told you a fact and you said, "Show me," that means you want me to give you evidence for what I said. How would Jesus show these revelations of his death and resurrection to his disciples? By opening up what the Old Testament prophesies about the Messiah's mission, which would include dying and rising from the dead, prophecies that already exist. Peter could not understand why Jesus would be saying these things, even though Jesus was opening up the Scriptures to him. To Peter, it was a tall tale, a gruesome fictional account that should only be told during a camping trip with teenagers. It was not typical for the religious leaders of Peter's day to talk about the Messiah in this way. Their teachings were more about national victory and reestablishing the throne of David, as well as successfully bringing the nation back into obedience to the Mosaic law. A grisly death didn't really seem to fit into this messianic narrative. But Jesus opened up the Scriptures and showed that this is precisely what was going to happen. That's why Jesus rebuked Peter as sharply as he did. Jesus accused Peter of setting his mind on the things of men rather than the things of God. Peter was not ready or willing to accept the will of God because it did not make sense according to the will of men. An unwillingness to accept the will of God, even when it involves death, comes from the bitterness that Satan holds against the Most High. That's why Jesus called him, "You get behind me, Satan." Rather, to set one's mind on God's things is to approach even pain and suffering the way our forefather Job did when he said, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel and without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." And he also said, "God understands the way, for he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom." So Peter's fault was not in his lack of concern for Jesus. He loved Jesus very much. But his lack of fear for the wisdom that is from above, which fault muddled his ability to understand the Scriptures. And I'd like to take some time to show you one of those passages that Jesus may have used in his revelation. This passage is not referenced in Matthew 16, but it is one of the most profound passages concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus. Our passage, which I read earlier in Isaiah 53, talks about the exaltation of the Messiah. But then immediately, and somewhat gracelessly, because there is no easy gradient in the prophecy's gyration, deteriorates into Messiah's humiliation. But Isaiah 52:23, which I'll read one more time for you, says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted." That was 52:13, not 23, I'm sorry. It works well with Isaiah 53:10 through 12, which also brings back the idea of Christ's exaltation. It works well as these two passages work well as bookends to the calamity that happens in between. This would be similar to Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, if you'd like to look those up on your own, which begins with Christ's heavenly estate, but plummets into his earthly humiliation and death, but then resurfaces at his heavenly and earthly exaltation. Isaiah reveals the reason for the Messiah's voluntary humiliation. He quotes, "He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities." This account reverberates the actions and consequences of Eden's dastardly duo. Adam and Eve plunged mankind into a state of godless despair because of their submission to the devil, and nobody who had been personally plunged into this despair, that is, nobody from the line of Adam and Eve, could reconcile mankind back into fellowship with God. That is why our deliverer had to come from on high. Someone completely separate from the line of Adam had to come to our aid. Yet in order to aid us, he would have to enter into the despair of the world. So it is the Son of God, who is a spirit, became flesh and dwelt among us, and he bore our griefs. He carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Notice all the times "our" comes into play. That is to say, none of the things that Christ did for us were his responsibility. All those things were rightfully ours. Grief, sorrow, transgressions, iniquities, all of those are rightfully ours. Yet Messiah came and was butchered as though they were his. He became the lightning rod for the wrath of God, which is justly due our sin. But we also see the result of this death. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. See that? To those who had lost peace with God, peace came. To those whose souls were ravaged, healing came. Christ is our mediator. Christ is our balm. But this wasn't all Jesus' idea. Just as John 3:16 said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," Isaiah said it first, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief." Though notice these passages don't reference the Father as the instigator of this plan of crucifixion. It is God in John, the Lord, and Lord in Isaiah. I don't know this for sure, but I see this as a whole triune Godhead being in agreement about the plan that must take place. And Jesus comes down to the earth to fulfill the plan. And once the plan is fulfilled, something very exciting happens. Remember in Matthew 16, Jesus wasn't just showing his disciples about his death, he also shows him about his resurrection. Isaiah continues, "When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days." The offering that Jesus makes for our guilt is his bloody death. But then we see his days being prolonged and his eyes seeing the result of his sacrifice. His death gives birth to offspring. And as David says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol." God prolongs the days of the Messiah. That is, he brings him back to life. God does not turn his back on him forever as to abandon him. He restores his life to him and restores his favor to mankind. We see Christ being exalted out of his humiliation, having made many to be accounted righteous, though they had no real righteousness of their own making. And one more thing. He bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Notice at the first, he bore our sins, which is past tense, but then he makes intercession, which is present tense. How? Because he's alive, forever interceding on our behalf. The devil incessantly tries to portray God's beloved as though they were still under the curse of Adam and Eve, but Christ is there constantly representing his new creation, his offspring, those who are no longer the offspring of Adam and Eve, but now are his very own. We no longer fear the grave, for we shall walk in the footsteps of Christ in death, but then raised into life eternal. Thank you for joining me, and tune in with me next time for the next one. Thank you.